My name is Tim. I come from the CluedIn team. I'm joined by a good friend, a colleague from Microsoft, Diogo, who will introduce himself in a moment. But let's first of all go over some of the logistics and the session itself. So today we are talking about a topic. I'm sure you've all heard the concept of a data mesh. Time has flied. It's been quite a long time since the concept had its inception. It's had time to make its way through the enterprise. I'm sure there are shared experiences, and we would like to, from Microsoft and CluedIn, share our experiences of implementing data mesh style projects using the Microsoft components. As I said, I'm joined by a good friend, Diogo. Why don't you introduce yourself before we head on to further?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Tim. So Diogo here from Microsoft, as Tim said. I'm a data and AI specialist, so I work with customers within the EMEA area, specifically with Purview. I do work with other data and AI products and services on the Azure side, but mostly I've been accompanying the last 2 years of basically the evolution of Purview, and now just recently the new general availability of the Microsoft Purview data governance component now, which has changed quite a bit. And I'm very glad to be here with Tim to talk about data mesh and how it actually implements with Fabric.
Excellent. So one of the things that I guess is a theme between Diogo and I is we both are pretty hands-on with working with customers in the field, and this has given us a certain exposure to the market, but also really what the market is asking for as well. Now, I would say that the opinions and I guess opinions and experience we're going to share today are those of myself and Diogo's, I'm sure there are other exposures that the audience that is joining us has had, but we wanted to give a real practitioner's view of how to distill essentially the concepts of data mesh into something that we can tangibly feel in our hands and feel that value as well. So let's dive in. Let's get started. And for those of you who would like to ask questions along the way, feel free to use the Q&A section to ask questions. Diogo and I will be monitoring, and we can, if we see the question is pertinent and timely, I think it would be good for us to take those. If not, we'll have some time for the end. So let's dive in. Let's dive in with, first of all, I guess the realization that when it comes to data mesh, the concept has been out for a while. I'm sure you've all had time to read up on it. Some of you might have read the plethora of books and articles and videos and webinars that have been done on the case. And I think we're going to take a different approach here with Diogo and I. I think we've had enough market and field exposure between CluedIn and Microsoft to actually move from having an opinion on this to an actual experience / exposure on this. And we're here to kind of share some of those stories. I'm going to first of all dive into, from the kind of CluedIn side, what we're seeing in the market. And then really interested to see Diogo give his inputs along the way. But I think one of the places we would like to start is that maybe the kind of contrarian slide as part of the deck, excuse my cough, is that one of the kind of key things we'd like to deliver over this next time that we have together is that potentially that things aren't as scary as they might seem. Things aren't as complex as they might seem. And one of the things that Diogo and I have both experienced working with our joint customers is that potentially, the concept of a data mesh has been maybe a little bit over-engineered to make the industry feel like it's this big, scary, furry thing. And Diogo and I both had multiple sessions before this webinar where we were kind of coming up with the content. And one of the themes that we both shared was that, no, it actually, I think once you are able to distill the kind of concepts in the data mesh, it turns out that actually, I think companies are probably a little bit more ready than they might think to take on some of the concepts, maybe not in their in the inception of the data mesh idea, but in a realized version of it as well. And so one of the things that we both had the pleasure of doing is working with customers of Microsoft and CluedIn in being able to actually implement a lot of the first principles of data mesh, but in a kind of simplified, somewhat dramatically simplified approach. And what would be, I think, interesting for the audience to hear is some of the learnings that we've got out of it, as well as probably some really counterintuitive learnings as well. Counterintuitive being, essentially concepts that have come from the book that have turned out to be quite the opposite in reality. So really looking forward to kind of sharing some of those concepts. Before I dive over to you, Diogo, to kind of share your input, I just wanted to kind of maybe take the original core concepts, principles of the data mesh. Diego and I are making a little bit of an assumption or presumption here that those of you that are joining have some exposure to data mesh, or at least at a high level understand the concepts. And this is not the Data Mesh 101 webinar. This is much further down the line where we've now had, we've now had the experience of implementing this from a Microsoft and CluedIn side, or at least some version of it. And it turns out that actually when you start to simplify some of the principles, they kind of do really make sense. But I think when you position them in a different light. So for those of you joining the webinar, feel free to Google or Bing in the background, the core 4 pillars of the data mesh. But we've rewritten them here to make sense to what resonates definitely with our audiences. And the first is this concept of, instead of talking about federated governance, we found that the best way to talk about this is in pushing the responsibility of data out into the lines of business. For us here and our customers, this is something that seems to make more sense to them, in that the real concept here is that poor old IT and engineering, we try with data. We try to help, but really we're not the producers in IT and engineering of data, and often we're not the consumers of it either. And so really, one of the principles is, right, how do I actually push that responsibility out to those that are the experts in the actual data itself? It turns out those people live in the lines of business, and I mean sales, marketing, HR, finance, accounting, engineering, product, just to name a few. And these lines of business, these users within those departments are not experts on data. They can't build data models. They can't write SQL and Python, nor do we want them to. We want them involved because they live and breathe that data on a daily basis, and they can spot things about data that none of us in IT and engineering can easily pick up on. And so we would like to reword one of those core principles. Instead of federated governance, we want to really reword this to pushing the responsibility of data to the lines of business. The second principle is data products. And this, for me, is the winner. This is the one that says this makes sense. I'm glad the market is thinking more like this right now. But it's also caused a lot of confusion and complexity in the market around what's encapsulated in this particular concept. And, once again, maybe CluedIn and Microsoft, we're adding more fuel to the fire by bringing our own definition here. But for us, if we were to dramatically simplify this, we would say this is really about taking assets within your business and making a concerted effort to actually productize them. And I know this seems like, well, Tim, isn't that just another way of saying data products? Well, it turns out that actually there is confusion in the market about what this is. And I think the best analogy that we can always bring is it turns out that it's about wrapping the product lifecycle around data and assets associated with data. And for me, the simplification is, listen, you've got all this data. At some point, someone in the business is going to say, right, let me take those particular data assets and let me invest in them. Let me put money into them. Let me put a team behind it. Let me put testing and marketing and all of those components you would put behind building a product like Fabric or Purview or CluedIn. And so for me, it's really about that commercialization of assets within your business. The next pillar, really about providing, the compute and the tooling to those who need it. So federating that compute. For me, this is where I think one of the most ironic parts are about it is that what we're seeing here at CluedIn is quite the opposite, is that as we move to platforms like Microsoft Fabric or centralized compute platforms like Azure Databricks, it turns out that what companies are actually looking for is how can they reuse that compute that they've purchased in those, big compute engines. It turns out that those compute engines are good for analytical workloads, maybe not all types of compute workloads, but the irony here being in that decentralization of providing infrastructure and compute to the edge. Where the market seems and where the kind of reality seems right now is that it's quite the opposite. It's that people are wanting to say, hey, listen, I want to do some good work, but can you use this central compute that I purchased from a Fabric, a Snowflake, a Databricks, and so forth? The final concept, I mean, for me, it turns out that, this is very similar to one of the core pillars of data mesh, and so it's already quite simplified. But really to think about data in terms of domains, and it's quite interesting. I've watched personally a couple of videos from the data mesh creator Jean-Marc in the last, I think it was last week. And one of the interesting pieces that came up there was, that this was something that master data management was supposed to solve. And she touched on the fact that, the reason it didn't solve the domain specific challenge of having our data in nice, kind of easy to understand business domains was one of the reasons for data mesh. And I can only agree with her completely. From the CluedIn side, this is something we also saw that, that traditional approach to solving master data management was just maybe good at some point in time, but I think doesn't match a lot of the modern needs of businesses. Diogo, I'm really interested to hear your input on your exposure with your clients of where are they thinking in terms of data mesh.
Mm-hmm. First of all, this is actually a great way to demystify a little bit around the complexities of data mesh. Let's say I'm saying complexities because I feel that it's been complicated more than it should, and the way that you define these steps is kind of a great way to also start on how I've seen other customers or customers of Microsoft or other companies that I'm seeing trying to implement something within the data space. It doesn't really need to be a central data platform. What I have been seeing is whenever something is trying to be done, let's say there's a company that wants to implement something within the AI space. There is still some work to do beforehand. And whenever we start distilling into what the company is actually doing, who is actually having the domain responsibility, let's say. So let's say HR data, where you have also sales data, and you might also have financial data. You have different people that are responsible for that data already. And there is a lot of the time companies that are already implementing data mesh, but they don't really know they are implementing data mesh.
Right.
And the way that you define these things where you push the responsibility to the lines of business, you already have that in some kind of way. You're just not we're also not seeing sometimes companies join that with the actual technology that enables them to do it. Okay. Most of the time, sometimes roles are not set. Let's say you don't have data steward, there isn't a data office yet. And those things are essential, okay? Because without those already structured, there isn't really a possibility to implement a data culture that's that feeds on a data mesh, let's say. And what I'm also seeing is whenever we try to push for productizing data products, as you said, there's kind of conflict a conflict there, but we're also trying to implement a culture of we're marketing our own data. So different departments might be marketing their data within the company, internally within the company. And when you're doing that, you're on your own already implementing a culture of, okay, I want more data quality to everything that I productize. I want to make sure that the data that I'm creating, anything, let's say I'm creating a dashboard on sales in the EMEA region, let's say, and I want to make it available for the rest of the company. What I might want to do now, if I'm implementing a data mesh culture, what I'll be doing is I'm making sure that it's completely ready to be consumed by the rest of the company. And so I'm going to automatically put in much more effort to make that consumable, let's say.
Right. Yeah, there's this behavioral part of it you're referring to of like there's this feeling that a data product, like we're actually going to invest a little bit more time and care and things into that it's not just, I guess, what we experience from data catalogs a little bit, Diego, where it was like once it's in the catalog, they will come. They will come and consume. And the truth was that was not the reality. It was that it was met with fair enough. It's right. So which of these files do I use? It seems quite technical sometimes. I mean, just think of the example of Diego, you handing me your laptop and saying, listen, there's some good stuff that you can take off my C drive. There you go. Give it a go. And being overwhelmed with that, what I would rather is a folder that you've set up, go, here's where all the important stuff, Tim, is. And that's where I would start picking apart these pieces. So I think that's some good input and some good analogies that you've got there. And the first of many as we dive into some more of those components here. So, there's a couple of key things that I think Diogo and I could give as good ideas for outside the data mesh as well is first of all, everything you do in data, every data initiative, please, please, please tie it back to some core business metric. Don't just do it because it's cool. Don't just do it because you can. It has to affect some top or bottom line component of a business. If it's the top line, we're talking things like revenue, margin, and profit. If it's bottom line, it's operational risk, it's lowering of costs. And the reason is not because, that seems like a good thing to do. It's because a lot of the time these data initiatives, to survive and to make its way into production, the technology, the project you might have built is amazing, but it also has to survive the turmoil of budgets on a yearly basis and reinvestment and people and teams and focus. Tying any initiative back to a data to a business metric is the first thing that's key. What's interesting is you could argue, okay, why is this not a principle of data mesh? And we've got the concept of data products, and maybe it's kind of buried somewhere within there. But for me, when we're talking about taking the best parts of the data mesh concept and instilling them into and productizing them, I think some of the good things to come out of it was this refocus on let's actually invest in data for a good reason. And that is like, where do we get this value creation out of it? Diego just touched on this a few times before, where you've got different teams that are wanting to produce their assets and they're putting extra focus on it. And for me, the recipe we're going to walk through today is really about, okay, how do I stitch the pillars together inside Microsoft ecosystem to provide me with the kind of output that data mesh was built for, which was putting a refocus on a couple of things. Number one is let's let's put a refocus on value, and we're going to do that with data products. The second thing that it did is it said, let's put a big focus on decentralization. And this is where I can only strongly disagree in this approach, in that whatever you decentralize will at some point have to be centralized, and whatever you centralize at some point will have to be decentralized. It turns out there's a concept already with this in mind, and that is the federated model. This is one of the ones we'll be touching on today. But one of the things that I think I enjoyed about going through the data mesh kind of industry trend, and let's see where it goes. That'll be super interesting to see where it actually evolves and lands. But one of the things I enjoyed about it was this emphasis on starting to involve the business more. At CluedIn and Microsoft, we have this kind of joint vision that is, data governance by the business for the business. Another way of saying this is data governance implemented and operated by the business, because, in a supply chain of data, IT and engineering are today playing significant roles in that. And good, thank you. We need that. That will always be needed. But at some point, we need to involve the business, and not as consumers of the data, not just as producers of the data, but they need to play some role in the middle. When conflicts happen, when data doesn't come together nicely, there will be the need to involve the business and say, how do you want to handle this? And if we need to crack that, because if we don't crack that in a good way, that's what often leads to handling data in CSV and Excel and SharePoint sites and things like this, which are, they get the job done, but at what operational cost and operational efficiency as well. So at Microsoft and CluedIn, as we'll go through this recipe, we'll be putting a big attention onto data mesh has shed this light on the importance of actually starting to involve the actual business in the supply chain as well, which I think is an important message to share. This is the slide. And Diogo, I would also be interested to kind of hear your input on this. I can see the question coming in as well. We'll check that in a second. Don't worry, we're not ignoring. We can spot that. I'll check that in a second. So let me start off by giving my input on this, and then Diogo, over to you for some comments. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of things I've learned in my career. My background is as a software engineer, and now I have the pleasure of running the CluedIn team, focused on building the most native MDM and data quality solution for Microsoft Azure. That ecosystem. And one of the couple of things I've learned in my engineering career, one is that when you're building products, it's not like one product is always just the best in the market, rather that as engineers, we just get a whole bunch of dials to turn. And if we turn up speed, then unfortunately the cost goes up. If we turn down resilience or robustness, then some other factor gets affected, maybe without us knowing as well. And so we don't just get to dial all of these knobs up to 10 and just have this amazing product. And my analogy here is really tying back to this piece here of, centralization is not a bad thing. Decentralization is not a bad thing. And often the pendulum, as it swings, most of the time we end up, well, the answer is probably somewhere in between. Often you start off in certain ways. You might start off in a centralized approach, and then the problem will eventually arrive that, we're not scaling at this point. Okay, so decentralization becomes an important factor there. But the truth is, if you start in the decentralization mode, well, it turns out that probably things like harmonization and data having silos and all of that, that's going to be your problem, right? So whatever you centralize, you have to decentralize at some point, and it goes the opposite way. Whatever you decentralize, it has to be centralized at any point. This is the federated model. This is why CluedIn and Microsoft are focusing on that. This is really the direction, and it's about farming off the responsibility, but providing all of that infrastructure and tooling and support of, listen, this might be scary for you. I know you're not experts in data. I actually don't need you to be experts in data. But as soon as you've got, business IP that you want to instill and you can't figure things out, we've got these central teams to help. Diego, what's your thoughts on this?
There's also the component of educating the people that are already working with the data so that they understand that there is always going to be maybe the central entity that's going to work on data policies and how data should be worked with. But it's also important, I see, on the end user side, that they know how they should interact with the data, of course, because in the end, if we're pushing everything to the lines of business, which is exactly what we want, because those are the people that know about the data itself. Okay. And we want to make sure those also have the independence to work with the data and understand what to do with it and how to productize it. However, I do see from let's say these three components of, and I thought it was quite interesting the way that you said that whatever is centralized will need to be decentralized at a certain point. It's an interesting take because it is actually the truth. In terms of, I thought you could go directly into maybe a federated model where we just work on that and we try to make it as federated as possible, let's say. But at a certain point, you'll have to centralize one thing and then afterwards decentralize it. There is just that point where the people that are, so the data consumers or the end users need to also, but that comes with time. They need to also understand how to interact with the data that they're being exposed to.
Yeah. You need to meet them where they are as well, Diego, in that there's no use, and I think this has been a failure of the past, in that, quite often, with no ill intent, we've bought tooling to help involve the business, but quite often this tooling requires them to be quite technical in nature to instill their business IP in. And, MDM, I think, has had a data quality tooling and data governance for sure has had that background where this tooling asks users to build complex business rules and regular expressions and think about data modeling. And I think in some way we forgot why we needed to involve the lines of business in the first place. And it's because they can look at data and they can say, okay, guys, here's a list of our products, and I know it's silly. There's a historical reason why we have to do this, but you know how you see the exclamation mark at the end of those product names? Yeah, that means that they're actually out of support and we can't solve them anymore, and we can't sell them anymore. It's like, well, there's no person outside of the scope of that line of business that would ever have guessed that or assumed that without having to go out proactively and ask, why is that there? And, instead of having that approach where we're saying, every time I see something odd with the data I don't understand, I need to set up meetings with the business, and all of that's still great. But at the same time, if we can operationalize that, we're going to lead to efficiencies. We're going to lead to solving that once and not having to solve it every time that we come and see that problem in a different place. So let's talk about the recipe. We are halfway through. And let's talk about the recipe of, like, what's our recommendations on getting the best out of the data mesh concept without maybe implementing it in its raw. I don't mean to say this as like a derogatory term, but a somewhat academic approach to something that can actually be tangible and fit in your hands right now. So I'm going to stitch together the kind of pillars, this fabric, this mesh across the Microsoft stack that can get you something up and running with those data mesh concepts still instilled inside of it. So the first pillar we're going to talk about is Microsoft Purview, and you've heard Diego talk about this before, but also interested in a moment to kind of hear his view on this as well. what was a data catalog has suddenly evolved from Microsoft into a fully fledged data governance platform, encapsulating a whole bunch of the defensive elements like information protection, things like privacy, things like GDPR and compliance, combined with a lot of the offensive parts of data governance in the terms of things like data products. Anything tied to that kind of top line of we think we can make money. We think we can make processes quicker and efficient and less painful in our business. These are the kind of offensive elements of data governance, and Microsoft Purview is that kind of one-stop shop now SaaSified as well, that you can kind of spin it up, host your important and maybe not so important assets. But the good thing is that the team have put at Microsoft have put a good abstraction in there, and that you're not necessarily exposing your entire data catalog out to the lines of business. You are wrapping it up in these little boxes of data products. And so, Diego, why don't you talk us through kind of some of the key concepts of Microsoft Purview and how you see this kind of relating into the data mesh world?
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned also before, just a few minutes ago, so Purview itself had a big evolution from the technical side, where maybe it was a little bit more of a platform where the technical team would use it, but then on the business side, it was a little bit harder for business users to use it in terms of looking into the data catalog, having a little bit of an interaction with the data catalog that would be easy to navigate. And we're seeing now these components of we're organizing things in governance domains, which is in itself already giving the transition into data mesh, let's say, because we're already setting the correct roles within the data catalog or from the governance domains, where you might have the correct people in each governance domain. Let's say again, I'm giving the departments as domains. Let's say HR, you have sales and financial data. Those can be governance domains, and you can set those people that are interacting with that data as the domain owners, and they will create the rules for the interaction of all the metadata within that domain. Okay. So you're still registering data sources wherever they are, bringing the metadata to Purview, and creating a data catalog that's based on that. Okay. And another component that has been asked about for the last 2 years, at least all the time that I've been interacting with customers, it has been a big component here, is the fact that you're actually trying to relate everything that you do to the business. And you said that before, where we also have the OKRs component, where anything that's, if you're setting a data product, you can actually relate it to a business goal or an objective. And then there's also the data quality side, where you didn't really have that. You can set the correct rules that you already want to implement within your domain, and make sure that every threshold that you have for what data quality is met within the governance portal within Purview. And then it becomes a much bigger platform when you're interacting with CluedIn, or when afterwards you're doing the connection to CluedIn, where you're also doing MDM. You'll see that there's different markets that have different maturities, where there's different companies that will not be implementing a technology yet. They're already using data mesh, but they don't know. We spoke about that before. And they're in the process of setting roles, setting the data stewards, who's the data office, who's going to be the data owner, who are going to be the governance domain owners, and then afterwards setting the data products as the central part where they're democratizing all of the data. And when you're then implementing MDM, they need to consider CluedIn as then the integrator with Purview. And that's where I'm also seeing the big value from it. Because if you're not doing MDM, it eventually can cause issues, and it's an important component of what Purview is, actually.
Good. I mean, there's so many. I mean, I wish we had another hour together after this as well, Diogo. There's so many points to touch on here in that, like whether you know it or not, all of these elements that you've got around data catalogs and, at least knowing what assets that you have across the business, there's some defensive elements of that, in that if you are like most companies, right, an audited company, you need to show you've got good practices around data. Good, tick. I can, from a data catalog, say, here's the data we have. Purview has that automatic tracking of where the data has come from, where it's going. Uh, you know, tools like and solutions like CluedIn have to be good citizens, in that any lineage that we generate, we should be writing back to that catalog as well, so we can show that end-to-end customer journey. But what we've seen is this evolution in Microsoft Purview, that it start to bring together a lot of these kind of offensive, top line, revenue gaining, revenue generating, margin increasing elements as well. And one of the things that I also just want to touch on, from reacting off what Diego said, is that like, imagine you are going on your data governance journey, whether that's Purview or CluedIn or Fabric, and it's still important that the implementation of your project goes well. That's super important. I think one of the things that Diego and I are trying to highlight is that the projects, no matter how well or badly they are implemented, its survival rate is really tied to your ability to say, at the end of the day, we need to constantly come back to the business and say, this is why we're investing in data governance, and being able to measure that with those OKRs that Diogo talked about is one way of saying, well, slow down. We should invest more in data governance, because I've got these proof points that our investments actually tie back to these key metrics of any single business. And so also, I think with the segue from what Diego was touching on, let's move into the MDM world, because Microsoft Purview is handling that kind of umbrella of data governance. And for those of you who are in this space, data governance is a huge category. It is made up of, it's this umbrella that sits over 30, maybe 40 subcategories of data, things like workflow, things like uh, privacy, things like MDM, things like data quality. And so CluedIn is basically playing those key roles for two components of that data governance umbrella. Now, don't blink too fast, because these are actually different tools. This is Microsoft Purview. This is CluedIn. So one of the key things we wanted to provide here at CluedIn is that if you are in that Microsoft ecosystem, you're going to have a great time with CluedIn. Not only to kind of add familiarity to similar user experience, similar UI, but just that native integrations that you're just one click away from connecting to Purview or Power Platform or Fabric, or Azure Data Factory, Power BI, Azure AI Studio, all of those components. CluedIn is an MDM tool that's actually built on top of the Microsoft services themselves, things like Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure Logging, things like Azure Disk for scalability, backup, and restore, and all those kind of scalable pieces of technology. So very much built on the shoulders of giants. And where these kind of tools play in hand is that Microsoft Purview is going to answer and tick these boxes of things like, what data do you have? Where is it coming from? Where is it going? Where's my private data? Where's my sensitive data? How do I classify data? All those kind of offensive and defensive elements. Now, whether CluedIn comes in is that federation piece that says, great, I know what data I have, but unfortunately, often it's not in a state that's easy for someone just to pick up and start utilizing. A good example would be, imagine building a data product, and it's to build something like a single view of a customer. Well, for most of you in the audience, that's not just going to exist within one beautiful file called customers.parquet or customers Azure SQL Server table. Most likely it's going to be coming from across a lot of systems, and that's going to look heterogeneous, and it's not going to connect in the same ways, and it's going to be dirty and have data quality issues and all of that. CluedIn is really playing that role of saying, well, let me help with actually federating that work out into the lines of business so they can start to actually play a role in this supply chain of data. The most important thing here being, CluedIn is not a tool that requires you to be technical. It doesn't require you to know how to code or to script or to write SQL or anything like this. It's really about meeting those people in the lines of business with the level of technical adeptness, which I don't expect any of them to have, technical skills. But man, I need them involved in the supply chain of data when we're trying to figure out if these two customers are the same or if that customer data is correct or not. And there's a real difference between what we can do in IT and engineering to help with data quality versus what we have those experts in the lines of business be able to do. Diogo touched on this before, is that Purview helps us set up that kind of responsibility chain. Good. But now I need to actually involve them. And when I need to ask them, hey, I need you to solve something, we want this to be a streamlined process where we provide them tooling that actually allows them to do their job. And this comes back to one of those principles of data mesh, i.e., to provide teams, domain teams as it's described, with the compute and infrastructure that's necessary for them to do their job. And this is where I would rather dramatically simplify it, is that for me, I think that is not the purpose. The purpose is I want to provide the experts on data with the right tooling they need to actually instill their knowledge of how they can help, instead of talking about things like compute and infrastructure. Once again, I think that's kind of over-engineered and overcomplicated what we're actually trying to do here. So the good thing is that, as I said, CluedIn is built on the kind of shoulders of giants here. That not only is it built on the actual Azure services themselves, so things like Key Vault and Functions and Monitor and Managed Disks and SQL Server, Microsoft Entra, Event Hub, things like this. These are all scalable services, but also one of the beauties is that as CluedIn customers, you get to wake up every single day and inherit the innovation from Diogo and his team there at Microsoft in how they're making this faster and cheaper and more scalable and more features and functionality. Over on the right-hand side, these are all the systems that we actually integrate with. Microsoft Purview is one of the components that we've talked about so far, but also the Microsoft Fabric environment for those analytical and machine learning use cases as well. Now, often they are downstream of CluedIn in that we want to provide those with high-quality data, but things like Data Activator, things like Synapse Engineering, being able to provide those with beautiful, clean, harmonized data is where we kind of usually fit into the overall stack. Now, imagine this case. And I think in all honesty, you don't have to use too much imagination for this. I'm sure this is something you're all very used to. This is the Microsoft Purview view of building brand new data products. And I have this fantastic idea that if I have a lot of new employees joining our company, wouldn't it be amazing to build a custom copilot that was trained with all of our data, and it basically allowed new employees to have a buddy, a copilot they could ask all types of questions to. Things like, and you can imagine if this is a large business, it might be things like, who's in my team? Who's in the chain of management up to the CEO from me? Who are our customers? What are the cultural values of this business? These are all questions I think it would be completely fair for a new employee to ask. Now, obviously, the kind of base models like GPT, things like Llama, etc., they're not going to know these answers. They're going to know generic. They're going to know generic ways to answer this question. And so, obviously, wouldn't it be a great idea, a data product that would be, let's build our own custom copilot. So this seems like a great place to, from a data mesh perspective, to have the inception of our first idea of what data product we're wanting to build. We've called it HR onboarding, and now we've started to involve a couple of assets. In this case, it's files from our data lake that could start to feed in to our custom large language model to help answer some of these questions that our large language models are not going to know. From a lineage perspective, Diego and I have already touched on this, but you can imagine that the journey of this data has started a long time before that data product. And being able to have a system that not only tracks that automated lineage, but also gives tools like CluedIn the ability to write its own lineage into it, provides that kind of end-to-end data estate that you're often hearing from the Microsoft group. Just to kind of give you an insight, majority, if not 90% of this lineage is actually generated by CluedIn through its mapping process. And this is very detailed and real-time lineage that you get when you're trying to solve this challenge of, it turns out with my data product, I don't have one single list of our employees. That's going to be an issue. In fact, it's e-export, emp add later, employees, Experian employees, they actually all have our list of employees, but they're not the same. They've got different column names. There's not a beautiful ID that just threads through it. And this is where we need to involve tools like CluedIn to say, this data product needs love. It needs cleaning. It needs data quality. It needs mastering as well. So the good thing is, between Microsoft Purview to provide this kind of nativeness, there's actually an automated sync that happens between CluedIn and Microsoft Purview, and that as soon as you create those new data products, you can actually just tell CluedIn to automatically import that data into the MDM system, so you can start consolidating, cleaning it, mapping it into common master concepts. So here's an example of where we're moving the discussion from metadata discussion, which Diego touched on from a Purview perspective, that we're talking about, files, we're talking about schemas, we're talking about columns. In MDM and data quality, we really need to start to actually look at the data itself. And if you look on the right-hand side of the screen here, there's some horrible looking data right there. This is not something I would ever want to productionize. We need to do something about this. We've got really creative ways of people putting in their job title. And of course, on the right-hand side, we've also got, mixed data types, and all of these things I want to provide in a way that doesn't require the person, the steward, the analyst that's fixing this to be technical. Rather, I'd like to provide them with good intuitive tooling to play their role. One of the kind of jobs of CluedIn is to produce this. And whether it's obvious to the audience or not, this is basically saying, hey, listen, instead of having 4 files with 10 employees in it each, I don't want 40 records to be pushed out to the system. I want 10. They're the same employees across the different files, but they're maybe not entered in the same way. They don't have the same ID or the same email. This is what we call a golden record. And this is what we want to drive out from our data product into the business. Now, with Microsoft Purview and CluedIn and Fabric, of course, being able to audit what happened to that data along the way, being able to actually visually see how these records get stitched together, because it's not always in this very deterministic way that how these records are composed together. If we're in a world where basically every system had this golden ID I could stitch together, we wouldn't be in this kind of problem where we had to have data quality and master data management solutions. The other good piece is that we get data quality metrics down at the record level, and Microsoft Purview provides us that at the asset level. Why is this important? Well, if we're talking about the context of data mesh, if we're productizing our data, you can imagine giving out data with low data quality, it probably won't last the test of time very, very quickly. So having that traceability and audit trail of what are the kind of general integrity and data quality checks of the data at that granular level, but also at that file level from Microsoft Purview. These are the things that are actually going to allow data mesh implementations to survive the turmoil of a production environment where everything just really just needs to work. All of this, and this is something that's not highlighted too much in the data concepts as well, is that we often hear these terms like data projects. They involve good technology, good people, good process, good culture, and process is one of those important pieces, not only from a supply chain perspective of, everything we do in a business has some type of process to it, some type of supply chain where multiple people have to maybe have their eyes over approving something, or we have, ticketing systems that need to be integrated with. The good thing is that CluedIn actually has the Power Automate platform, that powerful, RPA and workflow engine from Microsoft embedded directly within itself. And so for all the MDM and data quality process, like who is responsible and what channels they get notified on, like Teams or Slack or email, CluedIn gets to inherit all of those over 100 connections to these types of services. And this is embedded directly within the application itself. Now, we talked a little bit about Fabric. And so one thing from the CluedIn side, the good news is that we integrate with all of the different parts of Microsoft Fabric, from things like Data Activator to Synapse Engineering. We also integrate at the OneLake level, and we also support open standards as well for analytical use cases. So things like Parquet, they are some of the languages that we can talk when we are getting data out of the MDM platform into these downstream or even upstream systems as well. So this is just a short list of what we call our export targets. This is basically where do we want to send this beautiful and clean productized data, and wherever we spit it, the good news is that Microsoft Purview is there scanning these places, looking for picking up the cleaner, beautiful versions of the data. And that's what we want to productize. We want to productize the beautiful, clean, harmonized, consolidated list of employees in this case. And that's what we want to be able to drive into our HR onboarding Copilot. Azure AI Studio, up the top, you can see this is a place where we can send the data to, and this is where we could mount it into Azure AI Studio to even build a custom large language model based off this custom data that we're using to augment the base models. I think one of the things, the messages that Diogo and I wanted to leave the group with here is also that data governance is a really it's an investment that ends up being a huge accelerator. It's often described as an enabler, and I would also say that's true. But I actually think it's really, there are many cases where, unfortunately, a lot of amazing technology won't make it into production use cases if you don't have these good foundations in place. Microsoft Purview and CluedIn are bringing these kind of core fundamental pillars of lineage, audit trails, so we can keep reliability and trust in our data, things like clean data, things like the workflow that we just saw before, things like data quality metrics, actually having a good pulse on the level of integrity in our data. These are just some of the things you actually gain in any data initiative once you start to plug that into that supply chain. And so I think a good analogy would be that data governance in the end allows you to run instead of walk, and completely understand that you could do some amazing things with AI and business intelligence and analytics. But at the end of the day, this is really about having those things not only run and being published in a production environment and running there for significant amounts of time, but also tying it back to those key business metrics so we can always reinvest into what needs to be reinvested in. So one of the customer examples I would like to talk about is a customer that I've been working with recently, and that is a consumer goods company in Australia, and it's a very, very well-known brand in Australia, providing hardware and tools and all these things that unfortunately I'm the most unhandy person you'll probably ever meet. I leave. My wife is much better at things like fixing this, fixing the house and things with a hammer and things with a ladder. Even you can tell I can't even articulate it properly. That's how bad I am at these things. But one of the parts I love about their story and their implementation is that, to Diego's point before, they're implementing a data mesh without even knowing they're implementing a data mesh. And some of the big values they've got from this is, first of all, tying their initiative with CluedIn and the rest of the Microsoft stack into key business metrics. And what this has provided is this somewhat agile approach to kind of a progression over perfection, in that they're taking this approach that they are, in a way, digitalizing what was not digital before. And through this, they're taking this very much approach of, I would rather provide data in the form of data products, in kind of like we're increasing the quality of those products on a weekly basis in small little chunks, instead of wrapping that data up in a 6-month project where we hope at the end of the 6 months the data is going to be highly usable throughout the business. And so I would also employ anyone kind of looking into the data mesh to remind yourself that at the end of the day, tying this back to key business metrics is one of the most important things we can do. So with that in mind, I'm going to kind of head into the Q&A section. And Diego, are you okay if we take a couple of Q&A pieces here with the time we have left?
Yes, sure, we can.
Sounds good. So the first one, and I'm involved in companies that wish to build their in-house MDM instead of investing out of the box with tools such as CluedIn. What are the leverages that you would play with the senior management to make space for CluedIn? So the truth is, this is not only for CluedIn, this is also for Microsoft Purview and Fabric and tools that are kind of provided as solutions out of the box. It's this classic build versus buy. I would say to the audience member that asked that, it turns out a lot of people ask this question, and the best answer I've ever heard, I was at a Gartner conference and one of our customers showed up and they said, what allowed me to position things like CluedIn and get buy-in from management was actually showing them kind of the end solution first of, here is a report, or here is an output that the business is using today. Here's one I could give you. And this is if we invest in things like data governance. And here is if we don't invest in data governance. And if you can paint that picture really well, and this particular customer painted in the form of a Power BI chart where they said, here is a key report you use. Here is the answer we give you now. If I have and invest in MDM and data governance and data quality, this is the report I can actually give you. Which one do you want? And they were able to distill that in a way that it made it really obvious for senior management of, okay, I get it. I didn't know necessarily that data governance was the thing that I had to invest in. I would say going the other way around of saying, guys, we need data governance, we need MDM is not the right approach to take. It's about seeing kind of like those core business metrics and outputs. And that actually requires you, the audience member that asked this, to have a little bit of what's the word, like have some boldness to actually say, my belief in data governance is what will actually win us this. And so make sure you're showing senior management what you like, paint that end picture to get the buy-in for these types of initiatives. We have another question, Diego. So is the expectation that data owners, for example, will have to be defined at the mesh, purview, and MDM level? Great question. Or if you are using all together, can you define roles just at once? Diego, why don't you start us off?
Yes. So in this case, for example, you have in Fabric, if you're using Fabric, for example, as your central data platform, you can set governance domains and then afterwards roles from there. And that's one of the integrations that we're trying to have within Fabric and Purview, is that you can actually set roles from one place so that it actually trickles down to both platforms in itself. Okay. So that's you can do. I'm not sure, to be honest, Tim, how it actually then integrates with CluedIn, but you can do that on the Fabric and Purview side.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out being native to MDM, being native to Microsoft, we have the same answer. So, like Microsoft Entra is your place of truth when it comes to roles and responsibilities in groups. And so it turns out that when you're setting ownership in Purview and at CluedIn, you can do it at that role level. So I guess the initiation of those responsibilities, first of all, starts at Microsoft Entra, creating those groups of encapsulation, and then trickling it down to both CluedIn and Purview, which both support not only for single sign-on, but for access to RBAC and roles and responsibility as well. Diego, we've got a couple other questions, but we might have to follow up with people afterwards. But I will wish everyone a fantastic night or day where they are. Diego, thanks for joining us. Thanks for your input, and have a lovely day, everybody.
Just thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.